Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Can people hear me in the back?
No.
Well, how do you notice they know? You can't. I will try to speak a little bit louder. I've been warned that the audio on this system isn't perfect, but I do want to start first by introducing myself. I'm Mayor Cory Mason, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you tonight on this very important topic. A couple notes of thanks at the top. I just first want to thank the Racine Public Library for hosting this event tonight. If we could give them a round of applause. To have this conversation than here at the public library, so I'm glad to be here. I also want to acknowledge one of my colleagues on the council, Alder Jones. I think I saw her somewhere.
Yep,
There
yep.
she is.
There's another one in the back.
And Alder, newly minted Alder Young is
Hey!
Any other elected officials in the House that I've failed to recognize? Oh, County Supervisor Dempsey.
Sure. Library Nick. Library Nick.
Library Nick, yes. My children refer to him as Library Nick. I saw him if I made the turn to his elected official status, so my apologies, Supervisor Dempsey. So, good evening, everyone. I am thrilled to be here tonight. I want to talk tonight about why we're here, and that's to commemorate the National Fair Housing Act and National Fair Housing Month, which aims to increase efforts to end housing discrimination and raise awareness about fair housing rights. We marked the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act last year. The Fair Housing Act was designed to protect Americans from discrimination in housing, whether they were buying or selling a house or renting an apartment. 51 years after the passage of that historic act, it is true that we have made great progress, but it is also abundantly clear that we have a long ways to go. Racine has done some tremendous work, but there is much that still needs to be done. We must, in fact, renew our efforts to ensure equal housing opportunities for all people, free of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, family size, disability, national origin, or sexual orientation. And after 51 years after its passage, the Fair Housing Act, we cannot ignore the reality that racial segregation of our neighborhoods and our broader community is still very alive and very real. Fair Housing Months and events like this give us the opportunity to learn the history of it, and more importantly, learn the echoes of it that still ring true to this day. We must understand the historical practices and structures that created and maintained segregation, and importantly for me as Racine's mayor, I believe we must also understand the role that government played in creating and maintaining those patterns of segregation. I don't know if it's available for checkout here at the library, Nick, but if anybody has heard of the book that's come out last year called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, he does an excellent job of illustrating how these pernicious government policies from decades ago still ring true and echo here to today. So as Racine Mayor, I've committed myself not only to understanding our history, but really committed to learning more about it, and more importantly, reversing its pernicious effects over time. To help us understand that history, I am really pleased to have this conversation about a more fair and equitable future. And so with that, I'm about to introduce our speaker here tonight. But before I do, I also just want to acknowledge Alders Jones, or Alders Laren and Land, who've just joined us, in addition to Alders Jones and Young, who are already here. So we give them a round of applause. Looks like you're mostly from here, so you hear me plenty. I want to give you a chance to hear from our great presenter tonight. Reggie Jackson is an acclaimed Milwaukee historian, head Griot, did I say that correct?
Yes, sir.
Of the America's Black Holocaust Museum, and an award-winning columnist for the Milwaukee Independent. His work has been critically important to shaping both Wisconsin and national dialogue around fair housing, around race, equity, and inclusion, and many other important issues. So please, let's give a warm Racine welcome to Mr. Jackson.
Wow, thank you all so much. It's great to be back here in my second home, as I used to call Racine. I think I've been here close to 30 times now doing different presentations, so it's great to be back. It's been a while since I've been here, but I do see some friendly
Something to be proud
faces.
about.
Great to see you all again, and I'm excited to do this particular presentation. I've done some version of this presentation in libraries, churches, businesses, colleges, universities, all over the place. And I lost count, but I'm somewhere around 80 times that I've done some version of this presentation. So people are really interested in the topic. It's one that I really enjoy sharing with people. And so I'm going to have you all do the same thing that I've done over the last 4 years. Go on a journey to learn about how segregation developed. And I want to really make sure each time that I do it, I make sure that I customize it for the people that I'm doing it for. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about segregation here in Racine in terms of some of the things that were related to national policies that impacted your community here as well. I brought a few items with me. I have here a big copy of the Redlining Map that was drawn in Milwaukee in 1938. I will show you, as you can see, a copy of the Redlining Map that was drawn here in Racine in 1937. So I'll talk to you all about that in detail. And also I brought copies of a racial restrictive covenant that was written in Sherwood back in the 1940s. And so if you have time, you can come up and take a look. And even though it's 4 big long pages, there's only one little section that has the racial restriction in it. And I'll talk about how those covenants worked, why they were used, and why they were so pervasive, and how they were really the most important tool in creating segregated spaces around the country. So one of the things that I will do with you all tonight is I'm going to go through a lot of material with you. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because I have a lot that I want to go through. And one of the things that people often ask at the end of my presentations is, Reggie, can you share the presentation with me? And if you're planning to ask that question later, I'm going to answer it now, no. For intellectual property reasons, I don't want to share this with people individually because I give it to you, I don't know what you're going to do with it. You could say some other dude created instead of me, and I like to take credit for my work. So I know some of you who haven't seen me before, probably if you didn't see the flyer, you probably came here tonight expecting to see a baseball player, used to play for the Yankees, Mr. October. And I just want to let you know, you will not be disappointed because I was born in October, therefore I am Mr. October as well. And I did play baseball, I just played it very poorly. So let me begin by sharing with you a little bit about the work that I do. I am the co-owner of a company called Nurture Diversity Partners. Myself and my colleague Dr. Fran Kaplan and I started our company about 1.5 years ago after working together for almost a decade as volunteers with America's Black Holocaust Museum. I've been a volunteer with the museum since the summer of 2002. I've been the head griot at the museum. Griot is a term we use to describe the docents. We borrowed that term from the French-speaking part of West Africa to describe the oral historians of West Africa, the keepers of the history of their communities, and they play a really important role in helping people understand the community that they come from. And so as griot at the museum, I share seldom told stories in African American history. So the presentation I'm doing with you tonight comes out of a conversation that I had in December of 2015 with a reporter by the name of Ray Sanchez from CNN. He called me and he was writing a story about segregation, and because Milwaukee is the poster child for segregation, people always call somebody in Milwaukee, or they come to Milwaukee, or they do both, and he actually did both. He wrote a really nice article on CNN's website about segregation, and after that, everybody and their grandmother literally started calling me, asking me questions about segregation. Milwaukee Magazine contacted me to write a feature article about it. I did research for 3 months, wrote really, I thought, a great article, submitted it to them, and they never published it. And I'm still a little salty about that, but I got over it pretty quickly because I'm actually trying to turn that into a book about how Milwaukee became the most segregated community in the world. And if I can ever find any free time, I work on the book, and I haven't had much free time because Fran and I have been very busy We started our company, Nurturing Diversity Partners, about 1.5 years ago with the express intent of taking the messages, the teachings that we were doing in the city of Milwaukee with very diverse audiences of many African Americans in the city. We said we're missing the audiences in those suburban and exurban communities, those rural communities that are really, really very undiverse places that are mostly white communities. And we said we would need to reach out to those communities and begin to share with them the same thing that we share with everyone else in Milwaukee. And so I've been very actively traveling around the country. I've been to Texas on 3 different occasions. I've been to Newark, New Jersey. Fran and I have both been to North Carolina as well as South Carolina. We've been to Chicago. We've been to Detroit. But we spent most of our time in the state of Wisconsin. So I was just in Port Washington a couple weeks ago. I was in Madison last week. A month ago, I was way, way out in the southeast part of the state. I've also been to La Crosse. I've been to Wausau, Burlington, Kenosha, Racine, Wausau, Waukesha, Wauwatosa, Cedarburg, Mequon, just all over the state. And people keep asking us to come and talk about issues that people maybe 3-5 years ago didn't want to talk about, but people are actively engaged in having conversations. And they really want to learn. They want to learn what I like to say, how we got to where we are. So I'm going to share with you how we got to where we are in terms of our understanding of how segregation developed. I have a lot of information to share with you, so let me go ahead and jump right into it. So this is a quote from Dr. King talking about what segregation does. And I'm going to read it to you. I usually don't like to read stuff because I know that most people are pretty good readers, but I'm going to read this to you. Segregation not only harms one physically, but it injures one spiritually. It scars the soul. It is a system which forever stares the segregated in the face, saying you are less than, you are not equal to. And in addition to that, he also said that segregation harms not only the segregated, but the segregator as well. He said what it does for those who are segregated, it creates an inferiority complex, and for those who are the segregators, it creates a superiority complex. So we're going to talk about how all of this plays out.
We're living a crazy time when Dr. King and Mr. Mandela's dreams are coming true, and black people and white people and Asians, Indians, and everybody's hanging out together. They have interracial posses. It's unbelievable what's going on, man. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's unbelievable. All my black friends have a bunch of white friends. And all my white friends have one black friend.
I love that guy for 2 reasons. First of all, people always tell me that I sound like Chris Rock. I don't really think I do, but I think sometimes I do. But very poignant moment, him making a very good point. This is a study that was done showing who people have as friends. So for those of you in the back who may not be able to see it, at the top, it talks about the average white American. And if they had, say, 100 friends, 91 of those friends would be white people. And they would have 1 black friend, 1 Latino friend, 1 Asian friend, 1 mixed race friend, 1 other race friend, and 3 friends of unknown race. And for blacks, the average black person has 83 black friends, 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, no Asian friends, 3 mixed race friends, 1 other race friend, and then 4 friends of unknown race. Basically what this tells us is that we live in a very segregated society. I tell people it's not just about residential segregation where we live. We occupy segregated spaces all day long. The places that we shop, the places that we worship at, the places we go to school, the places we play, we're in segregated spaces all the time. And because of that, we don't get to know people from other groups very well. And it's very rare for us to get to know people if we live in a very segregated community like the community in Milwaukee. And I'll talk a little bit about Milwaukee because it's kind of, like I said, the poster child for segregation. But one of the things that I believe very strongly in is that the real damage that segregation does is it prevents us from really getting to know people from other groups. And the way that we interact with people is simply based on those stereotypes that we have of people. The things that we've been basically bombarded with our entire lives, how to see white people, how to see black people, how to see Latinos, how to see Native Americans. We're getting constant reinforcement of that from magazines, television, newspapers, movies, everything. We get this constant reinforcement to see people in a very specific way. And if we don't know any people in that group personally, then we just make assumptions that people fit into those categories. So that to me is the lasting damage that segregation does. The same study showed that 3/4 of white people in the United States do not have a single friend who isn't white. Let me repeat that. 3/4 of white people in the United States do not have a single friend who is not white. That's very, very problematic, because what it does is it means that all of those white people who don't know any blacks or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans personally, they have no real understanding of those people, and they will base their interactions with those people on what they've been told about them their entire lives. And I tell people all the time, people say that racism starts at home, that it starts in the family. If we would just start teaching our children to be racist, then we'd be better off. It doesn't work like that in the real world, ladies and gentlemen. You do not have to teach it to your children or your grandchildren. They're going to learn it simply by being an American.
Yes.
They're going to get the reinforcement somewhere, somehow, whether you're there and a part of it or not. You can't escape it. When I was in the Navy many years ago, we traveled to Sydney, Australia. We're in a little pub in Sydney, Australia. How many of you guys remember the old Fat Albert show, Bill Cosby Fat Albert show? Remember the character Mushmouth? The guy would, we do it, and talk like that? We were in a little pub, and there was a group of about 5 or 6 of us African Americans having fun with these Australian guys. They love Americans in Australia. If you've never been to Australia, if you go, wear something that says USA on it, and you get free drinks all day long, I guarantee you. We were at this little pub. I don't drink. I was watching my friends drink, having a good time. And one of the Australian guys, he said, listen, I want you guys to do me a favor, and I want you to talk like that guy from Fat Albert. I want you to talk like Mushmouth. And we're like, dude, nobody really talks like that. That's a cartoon character. He's like, no, I know that you guys talk like this. You're just not talking like this because we're around, but really talk like, we're like, dude, it's a cartoon. Bill Cosby created this character. No black person ever has talked like this guy. And the guy just continued to insist, and after a while, my friends were ready to beat the living daylights out of him. His friends took him out of the pub, and we enjoyed the rest of the evening. But it showed me that even though I was thousands of miles away from the U.S., that people automatically have these misperceptions of black people embedded in their psyches. So these are some findings from actually just last week. Pew Research Center did a survey asking Americans about their views on race. So this is very recent data that I want to share with you. A plurality of Americans say the country hasn't gone far enough in giving black people equal rights with whites. For whites, 37% said that the country had not gone far enough. Blacks, 78% said the country had not gone far enough. For Hispanics, 48% said it had not gone far enough. And for those who said it had gone too far, actually 15% of all the adults surveyed said it had gone too far. 19% of whites said it had gone too far. 6% of blacks said it had gone too far. 9% of Hispanics said it had gone too far. And so we see that there are differing opinions about kind of race relations. And there's some other information from the same survey. Majority of whites, blacks, and Hispanics say race relations are bad, and many say that they're getting worse. So for all adults that took the survey, 58% said race relations are generally bad, 41% generally good. 56% of whites said it's generally bad, 71% of blacks said generally bad, 60% of Hispanics said generally bad. So there is some agreement. However, blacks and Hispanics see it in a little bit different way than whites do. And I think that as we kind of learn the things that I'm going to teach you tonight about segregation, you'll kind of understand why those views are a little bit different based on race. It's really based on your lived experiences. And this piece also, majority say being black is a disadvantage. Being white is an advantage in our society. So for being white, 12% of whites said that it hurts a lot or a little. 59% of whites said it helps a lot to be white. For Asians, 34% said it helps a lot to be white. 23% of Native Americans said that it helps a lot to be white. 18% of Hispanics said it helps a lot to be white. And then for blacks, 17%. So whites and blacks differ in their views on how blacks are treated. 84% of blacks feel that blacks are treated differently by the police. 87% believe they're treated differently by the criminal justice system. 82% believe they're treated differently in pay and promotion. 74% believe they're treated differently when they're getting loans and mortgages. And 70% believe that they're treated differently in restaurants. Those are blacks. For whites, only 63% of whites believe that blacks are treated differently by the police. 61% of whites believe that blacks are treated differently by the criminal justice system. Only 44% of whites believe that they're treated differently in hiring, pay, and promotions. And 38% of whites believe they're treated differently in loans and mortgages. And only 37% of whites believe that blacks are treated differently in stores and restaurants. Like I said, it's about your lived experiences. And for those of us who doubted these things for many years, fortunately we have viral videos. We've heard stories of people who are basically having white people call 911 on them for just being a black person, for mowing the lawn, for barbecuing in the park, for sitting in Starbucks without spending ridiculous amount of money on their overly expensive coffee. So a variety of different things. And we're beginning now to see evidence, and I believe that more white people are believing these stories that blacks have been telling for decades that whites have doubted, but now we're beginning to see evidence of it. So I think there's a shift that's taking place, but it's still, a lot of whites are still doubters. So in 1910, about 90% of black people in the country were still living in those former slave states, the former Confederate states, and they began to leave, not because they wanted more and better job opportunities. They were leaving because they were tired of Jim Crow segregation, the degradation of it, the humiliation of it, and they were tired of being killed. They were tired of being lynched. They were tired of being the victims of white mobs who were basically coming into black communities, beating, killing black people, looting their stores, homes, businesses, and burning their communities to the ground. They were leaving because they were fleeing their lives. And about 6.5 million blacks left the South from 1910 to 1970 in the Great Migration. And by 1970, you had about 53% of blacks that were living outside of the South versus 90% in 1910. So, segregation, you may hear people say that Milwaukee is the most segregated city in the country. It is not. They don't measure it by cities, they measure it by metropolitan statistical areas. They look at a geographical region and they compare people of color to whites. So they look to see how evenly dispersed those people of color are in a geographical region. So if they're very evenly dispersed, then that segregation index, which is known as the dissimilarity index, will be very low. The lowest number is 0, that means complete integration. And then the more disparate way that they're in that community, say they're concentrated in pockets together, then those numbers will be much higher. So when they did the census in 2010, this is where the data comes from every year, or every 10 years when they do the census, they measure each state and they measure each county around the country, and this is what they found with the state of Wisconsin. That Wisconsin was the second most segregated state in the country. The only one that's more segregated is Illinois. And an easy way to understand what that 78 means, and that number would be 81 for metropolitan Milwaukee. That means that 78% of blacks in the state, or 78% of whites in the state, would actually have to pack up and move to new neighborhoods for us to get to a completely integrated society. So we have people that are segregated in concentrated pockets away from one another. So there are some myths about segregation that I want to cover really quickly. One is the myth that segregation is about, the economy. Poor people tend to live together, middle class people tend to live together, wealthy people tend to live together. That's absolutely not true if you look at the data. A group did a microanalysis of housing markets and racial discrimination. This is a group from Stanford University in 2005, I believe they did the study. And they said only a fraction of the observed pattern of black residential segregation can be explained by low incomes or other measurable socioeconomic differences. What they knew was that the pattern of segregation was defined by our federal, state, and local governments that created the segregation that we have. They knew that it had less to do with the economy than policies that were put in place that lasted for many decades. There's another myth that white ethnic segregation was the same as blacks. When the Italians came over, they were segregated. Oh, when the Irish came over, they were segregated. When the Poles came over, that is absolutely true. They were segregated. However, they were not segregated in the way that blacks. There were not neighborhoods that were all Polish or all Italian or all Scandinavian or whatever. There were never any white ethnic groups that lived in the community. It was simply them alone. Blacks have for decades lived in communities where they were the only people in that community. And so that's the big difference. Do not believe that those white ethnic groups were segregated in the same way, because they were not. So white people's ideal neighborhood. This survey was taken in 2008 by the University of Chicago, and they asked people, tell us what your ideal neighborhood would look like. And what they found was that 28% of whites support an individual homeowner's right to discriminate on the basis of race when they sell their homes. 28% of whites said they should be able to discriminate. They know it's against the state law. They know it's against federal law. However, they said they should have the right to do so. So when you look at the data from the survey, 20% of white respondents said their ideal neighborhood would be all white neighborhood. So 20% of whites said their ideal neighborhood will be a neighborhood that's all white. 25% said their ideal neighborhood would be a neighborhood that has no black people in it. That's their idea of their ideal neighborhood. And then 33% said their ideal neighborhood is a neighborhood that has no Hispanics and no Asians. And so this was a survey of whites talking about their ideal neighborhood. And then 25% of white respondents said they would live in a neighborhood where one half of their neighbors were black. That was what they wanted. So they said, I don't want to live with black people. If I can avoid it, I will. And so what happens is people had the ability to create all white neighborhoods. And I'll talk to you about the tools that they use. African Americans overwhelmingly prefer mixed neighborhoods. Black people don't want to live in a neighborhood that's all black. Every year that surveys are taken, blacks talk about their ideal neighborhood being a diverse neighborhood. Of all of the groups that they survey on this, the group that always has the most diverse ideal neighborhood are always black people, consistently year after year after year, going back even to the 1960s when they asked the same questions. This is a map of Wisconsin. I know you in the back can't see it. These are all 72 counties. I had an argument with the guy, but it wasn't really an argument. He tried to argue with me. He didn't know what he was talking about, so I had to create a map to show him he didn't know what he was talking about, to show you that black people do not live in most parts of Wisconsin. They are concentrated in southeast Wisconsin. There are only 5 counties where the black population is more than 5%. So this is a map that shows you in Ozaukee County, Milwaukee County, Kenosha, Racine County, Dane County, just a handful of counties where there's a significant black population. And some of the counties that you see up north that have a larger number of blacks in them, they're really not what you think they are, because many of those blacks that are living in those counties are actually living inside of a state prison or jail.
That's right.
But guess what? They're counted as members of those communities. They are literally using those people to get more representation in state government, as well as to get more money from the government, because those people are counted not from the county they came from, but from the county that they currently reside in. So this is the population of Racine County, and as you can see, most of the communities are not very diverse. And I'm just going to tell you the white population of each for those of you in the back who can't see it. Burlington, 98.9% white. And this is from data the Census Bureau does estimates. Every 10 years they do a full count and then they do estimates. So this is based on a 5-year estimate that was done in 2017. Burlington, 98.9% white. Caledonia, 91.7%. Dover, 90.2%, Elmwood Park, 81.5%, Mount Pleasant, 86%, North Bay, 89.7%, Norway, 96.7%, the city of Racine, 50.2% white, 21.8% black, just under 3.7% Native American, 0% Asian. I'm looking at 1.1% Asian, 22% Latino. Now, part of what's really weird about when the census is done, and the Census Bureau, people don't know this, but they have added categories. Every year they're constantly adding categories. So they added categories like 2 or more races, and also Latinos are typically not counted as a racial group. They're an ethnicity. So you can be black and Latino, you can be white and Latino, you can be Asian Latino, and they generally do not separate them out, but I was able to separate them out. Raymond, 94.9% white, Rochester, 97.8% white, Sturtevant, 73.2% white, Union Grove, 89.1% white, Waterford, 93% white, Wind Point, 91% white, Yorkville, 95.2% white. So you have a city, Racine, much like Milwaukee, that's a fairly diverse city surrounded by communities that have little to no diversity, and that's where you all are living. This is what's known as a racial dot map, housing and urban development. If you go to their website, you can find these maps for all over the United States of America. If you want to know exactly where to find this particular map, the Housing and Urban Development had an initiative that they started under the Obama administration called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And as one of the tools, they've looked at what communities look like, and they've created these maps for us. And so the orange dots are where whites live, the green dots are where blacks live, the blue dots are Hispanics, The black dots are Native Americans, the purple dots are Asians, and then there are 2 other categories. And you can't really see it all that well because it's actually pretty diverse here in this community. And I'm going to show you the one in Milwaukee. You'll see the difference in Milwaukee. But this is where every black person in the area lives. So you can see that they're kind of parceled in a variety of different places, but they're kind of concentrated in the central part of the community. This is where Hispanics live. They're kind of in a lot of different spaces, but kind of concentrated, much like the blacks are in the central part of the community. For whites, you can see that they are all over the community, but there are places that have little to no white people living in it, and those are typically black and Latino neighborhoods here. And by comparison, you know, people talk about segregation in Milwaukee, and I tell people that the way that you can see segregation in Milwaukee, what it looks so different, is that there are neighborhoods that are all black or mostly all black in Milwaukee. And when you look at the 4-county area in Milwaukee, you can see that clearly. That's the 4-county area. Inside that red border is the city of Milwaukee. And you can see almost every black person in the 4-county metropolitan Milwaukee area lives in Milwaukee on the north side and northwest side of the city. And very few are outside of that box. In fact, if you look at Milwaukee County, there are 19 cities in Milwaukee County. Only 6.4% of black people in Milwaukee County live outside the city of Milwaukee. There's 18 other cities they could live in, but they're stuck in the city of Milwaukee. And that's why we have the highest segregation index in the country. So, for those of you who are looking for some resources to learn more about this, the mayor mentioned The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I've actually shared programs with Mr. Rothstein on 2 occasions in Milwaukee. He and I have become pretty good friends over the last year or so. His book, The Color of Law, is the most recent and really well-researched book. There's another great one called Choosing Segregation by Arnold Hirsch, and then one called Crabgrass Frontier by Kenneth Jackson. And Mr. Hirsch tells us that a conscious and deliberate choice for segregation lay at the heart of national policy. So let's look at how those policies developed over the course of time. Let's look at what happened. So these are the tools of segregation. One is to create communities that are exclusive and restricted. That was a community that was being built, a new subdivision being created in New York State. And they told you basically that it was exclusive and restricted. And people who knew what those terms meant, they knew that that meant it was going to be all white. And this sign on the other side, entering Wauwatosa City of Homes, restrictive zoning. The city of Wauwatosa had those signs. It's a big metal sign. That picture is from the sign that's posted on the side of the Wauwatosa Historical Society building. But they had those signs all over Wauwatosa, including in City Hall. I was able to talk to one of the aldermen from Wauwatosa, and he told me, he said, Reggie, that sign that was in City Hall in Wauwatosa, they just took it down last year. He says, but what's even more amazing about that sign is somebody knew how embarrassing that was to Wauwatosa, and what they did was they came and they got some green duct tape, and they literally taped over restrictive zoning, as if nobody would know. They took the sign down that Alderman has it. He told me I can borrow it. It's very heavy. I didn't want to transport it down here to show you because it was just too heavy. So anyway, and at the bottom there's a copy of a restricted covenant that was written in Minnesota. And I'll talk to you about those restrictive covenants because I think they were very, very important. Racial restrictive covenants were legally enforceable contracts imposed upon the buyer of a property. So if you owned the property, you were required to abide by the terms of these covenants. And these covenants, much like the one I had with Mr. Shorewood, many of them had racial restrictions in them. And it basically meant that this told you who could and could not legally occupy that space. They were used primarily to keep blacks out of white neighborhoods, but they also impacted many other communities. But all of them, every one of these covenants that was written, and there were literally tens of thousands of them written around the country, all of them restricted black people. Some restricted Asians, some restricted Native Americans, some restricted Jews, but every single one of them absolutely restricted black people. And so they were really important because they were mandated that you follow the terms with, if you didn't, you could lose that property. So what happens is, these became even more important when the Federal Housing Administration, which was the entity that was helping most Americans become homeowners, beginning in the 1930s when they created the first amortized mortgage, and they literally did a system, they put a system in place that changed the way people became homeowners. Prior to 1930, it was practically impossible to become a homeowner in the U.S. You usually only had 3 to 5 years to pay it off. If you were able to get a mortgage, you had to pay 50 to 75% down, and it was really just not a good system for most Americans. Federal government stepped in and created a new type of mortgage, an amortized mortgage, which allowed you to have 10, 15, 20, eventually 30 years to pay off that mortgage. They lowered the down payment to about 5 points maximum. They made it much easier for people to become homeowners because they really wanted to spur the economy by building houses and putting people back to work. And they also felt that if we got people to buy homes, that all of these people that are leaning towards communism are going to lean back in the opposite direction and become Americans who love capitalism. So they made Americans homeowners, and it was very effective. And what they did, however, is the Federal Housing Administration helped millions of Americans become homeowners by giving them those loans. However, they made sure that black people, for the most part, did not get those loans. They required you to have a racial restrictive covenant attached if you wanted them to give you that loan, and white people said, okay, we'll do it. All right, so they required the city and county plans, zoning regulations, and racial restrictive covenants must be in place for development to be favorably considered for mortgage insurance. This is in the underwriting manuals that the Federal Housing Administration began to write in the 1930s through the 1950s. This language was in them from 1930 all the way through 1950. And this language basically mandated that people follow the terms of the Federal Housing Administration and create segregated spaces. Some of the other things that they did, it would guarantee the question whether a new neighborhood had covenants that prohibited the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. By the race for which they are intended. So these were some of the tools they used. They wanted to create communities that were specifically for the race that they were intended for only. So they created spaces that were all white to the detriment of people of color. In addition to that, these were used all over the country. In fact, our famous former Supreme Court Chief Justice Rehnquist, Senator Joseph Biden, as well as President John Kennedy have resided in homes during the course of their lives that at one point in time, way back in the day, had a racial restricted covenant attached to them. Now these racial restricted covenants were, they started to write them in the early 1900s. They were deemed by the Supreme Court in 1948 to be unenforceable. 1968 they became unconstitutional, but most of them are still in place. Because in order to get rid of them, you have to go back and find the person that wrote them to write an amendment to get rid of them. So I'm sorry you're not going to find Mr. Smith, who wrote that covenant in 1917, to have him write an amendment. So if you do a property check on your property, you may find the covenant is still there, even though they're not enforceable or unconstitutional. They're still there. All right. So a brief history of these covenants. They basically dictated who could and could not occupy spaces. They began writing these in the early 1900s, and they were used as a tool to create all white spaces. The reason that they started to use these tools was because the Supreme Court, in a case in 1917, ruled that the use of racial zoning laws was unconstitutional. They used to simply write laws that said blacks can't live in this neighborhood, Jews can't live in this neighborhood, Mexicans can't live in this neighborhood, and so the NAACP challenged that, and in a case called Buckley versus Worley in 1917, the Supreme Court ruled that yes, that is unconstitutional, so the racial restricted covenants took the place of them because the Supreme Court ruled that these are simply agreements between private parties. Therefore, they are perfectly legal. All right, so I like to use this term in aversion to diversity. We talk about our nation as being the most diverse country on the planet Earth, and that we are. And we talk about our country as being a melting pot, that which we are not. I tell people we shouldn't want to be a melting pot. In fact, we should want to be a salad bowl instead. Because if you're a melting pot, all of the flavors mixed together, and you can't tell the difference. But if you have a salad, you can taste the different lettuce, you can taste the onions and the tomatoes. And I prefer variety. When I eat, I like a variety of different flavors. So I want America to not be a country where all of us have to assimilate into one type of person. I want us to not only appreciate the differences that different cultures have, but to really relish that difference. Imagine if we were all the same. We'd be a very boring place to live. So, we, however, as a nation have had an aversion to diversity. Let's look at this racial restrictive covenant that was written in Shorewood, written in 1927, and it was set to expire in 1946. At no time shall any portion of said subdivision or any improvements erected thereon be occupied by or sold, conveyed, mortgaged, pledged, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person of Negro or Ethiopian descent, provided, however, this is not intended to include or prevent occupancy by such person as a domestic servant or while actually employed in or about the premises by the owner or occupant thereof. So if you were a person who was a domestic or a person doing lawn work, you can legally occupy that space at that moment doing that work, but when you were done with that work, you could no longer legally occupy that space. Here's another one. This one, next one was written in South Milwaukee, and the reason I share this one is because the date of expiration for this one was January 1st, 2024. This one was written in 1937. At no time shall any such lot or any building thereon be purchased, owned, leased, occupied, or used by any person other than citizens of the United States of America of the white race. This provision shall not apply to domestic servants which may be employed by the owner or occupant of any such lot or building thereon. The reason I want to show you those is because I want people to understand that these are the types of languages that was used in these covenants around the country. In fact, the federal government told communities, if you don't know how to write one of these covenants, here's a template, here's the language to use, and you can write as many as you want. So they actually assisted people in writing those covenants, and they were written all around the country. And like I said, they were used to create all white spaces to keep people of color out. Redlining maps. How many of you guys have ever heard of redlining maps? Okay, good. They were not called redlining maps, however. The federal government never called them redlining maps. They were known as residential security maps. So they were drawn by the federal government from 1934 until 1940 in 239 different cities around the country, including Milwaukee, Madison, Racine, and Kenosha here. The one for Racine was actually drawn, and this is a copy of it in 1937. They were given a color code and a letter designation. So they broke the communities into 4 different categories. Green would be the best communities. And what these maps were drawn for was to let people who were going to give loans to people to buy properties, they wanted to let them know where the best places and the worst places to give people loans in. So if it was a green place, they said that's the best place to give people loans. It's a really, really nice community. If it was blue, it was a still desirable community. If it was yellow, they call it a definitely declining community. And if it was D, that was considered to be a hazardous community. They were basically telling you do not loan people money in those communities. Some people did, but it was very hard to get a loan for a mortgage for either a home or business in a red community. However, that yellow one where it says definitely declining, the language that they used on these is very specific. In addition to the books, each one of these maps came with a book that described why the areas got the designation that it got, and it told you about what they referred to as the inharmonious racial groups that were giving that area the designation that it gave it. That was the term they used, inharmonious racial groups. So if one of those inharmonious racial groups is moving close by, that was an area that was definitely declining. So I want to show you what the areas in Racine, there were several that were redlined. Some were redlined for a variety of reasons. So some were redlined because of the people who lived there, so those inharmonious racial groups, but they were also redlined because, well, in 1937, they hadn't been fully developed. You know, they didn't have a modern sewage system. It wasn't really a great place. But I'm going to show you an example of the ones that were redlined related to the people who lived in them. And in 1930, the African American population of Racine was only 0.7%. By 1940, it was even less than that. It was 0.6%, according to the Census Bureau. So, Area D1, and those of you who live here, you know the map better than I would. This area has no future for a long time. Poor class of residents, Italians, predominating, infiltration of Italians are the terms that they use to describe Area D1. Area D2. 20% Jews along railroad junkyards to west. Only foreign element will buy any property in this area. This is one of the oldest sections in the city. Homes are old and hard to maintain. A very undesirable area, rapidly on decline, north to High Street. Armenians predominating, infiltration of foreigners. Area D3, a foreign settlement, poor maintenance, railroad, and surrounded by factories in which these residents worked. Some Negroes, an undesirable area. Italians predominating, infiltration of foreigners. Area D4, Any mortgage loans made here would be ultra conservative, a foreign settlement with colored element spotted throughout, all factory laborers in undesirable area, Polish, Armenians predominating, infiltration of foreigners. So when I tell people that redlining was about more than just black people, they don't believe me. All you have to do is look at these maps and look at the books that came with the maps. If you want to learn more about the maps from maybe other cities around the country, maybe Cleveland, Detroit, other cities that you may have lived in, there's a great website called Mapping Inequality. If you go to that website, you can find the maps for, I believe, 80 different cities, and they have the documents that tell you why each area was given the designation it was given. So I want you to watch a video. This was done by a group, and I heard that they're going to be coming here to Racine, a group at the University of Minnesota. They have a project there called Mapping Prejudice, and what they're attempting to do is to map all of the racial restricted covenants in Hennepin County. I met with the lead of that group in Milwaukee when he came to do a presentation. I had a good conversation with him. I eventually went up to Minnesota, met with the whole team, and we're going to actually try to replicate their project in Milwaukee to actually map where every racial restricted covenant in Milwaukee County was. It's a huge project. It's very time consuming. They've been working on their project for about 3 years, and they're still not done. It's a huge project. But this was a documentary that was done by the local PBS station in Minneapolis. I'm hoping that those of you in the back can hear it. And if you can't, then you can find the full version. This is a short version of it. You can find the full version if you go to YouTube and just type in Jim Crow of the North. It's an absolutely phenomenal documentary that was done. So I'm going to start it now.
And this is where you first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African blood or descent.
100% of them were aimed at black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism have a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the streets, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
When you can covenant entire areas of the city, it makes it off limits. That's pretty powerful. This is Jim Crow of the North.
The Supreme Court even held that restrictive covenants were constitutional. This was in a case of Corrigan v. Buckley, and it was in that decision where the court resolved that restrictive covenants are contracts, and as such, they are lawful. Now forget about the fact that they discriminate, and forget about the fact that once we say these contracts exist, we are bringing up a violation issue of the 14th Amendment. Forget about that. The key thing is that the Supreme Court validated segregation, validated discrimination.
You have the full force of the law, the court system, determining who could go where.
And what will happen as a result of that is you'll see efforts to ensure that a denial to one of the most basic foundations of opportunity for African Americans will be codified in the United States as a result.
You had not only the courts supporting it, but also a kind of license of sorts of people going to the streets and harassing blacks who moved into white neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place.
So, as you can see in the video, these policies were not only put in place by our government, but then supported by the Supreme Court in case after case. And so as a result of that, we have to really point a big, gigantic finger at the federal government, particularly the Federal Housing Administration, in terms of the role that they played in creating it. Their underwriting manuals, these are some of the things that were in their underwriting manuals. They contain instructions and regulations governing procedure and policies to be followed by their underwriters. and it also described the techniques used by the Federal Housing Administration to determine whether or not mortgages are eligible for insurance. So you really needed them to help you get a mortgage for many years. Most Americans depending on the federal government. So these are several things that are in these underwriting manuals. Were in there from the early 1930s, actually from the 1934 all the way through 1950 was in the manual. Deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influence such as inharmonious racial groups. So that's where they're basically saying, tell people to use these racial covenants. In addition to that, it must be realized that deed restrictions to be effective must be enforced. So they're saying not only should they be used, but you have to make sure that they're enforced, because if they're not enforced, then they're useless. And they said that these restrictions themselves offer little or no protection from adverse influences if they're not enforced. In addition to that, natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences. Usually the protection from adverse influences afforded by these means includes prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. So they were telling people, create artificial barriers. In Milwaukee, before the federal government even started telling people how to create artificial barriers, how many of you guys are familiar with where Miller Park is in Milwaukee? Right? That valley, the Menominee Valley, that valley, the northern edge of that valley is actually the northern edge, or the southern edge of where blacks used to live in Milwaukee in the 1920s. The city of Milwaukee decided that blacks were creeping too close to white neighborhoods on the south side, so they rezoned that entire area as commercial instead of residential to create an artificial barrier to keep black people from moving south in Milwaukee. One of the other tools that was used around the country, and it was very productive, was to build little things that we call interstates. So in Milwaukee, this area here, the gray box you see, that was an area that was redlined in 1938, and as you can see, Interstate 43 cuts right through the heart of that area that was redlined. In Chicago, these areas are redlined and interstate cut right through the heart of it. They did this in city after city after city. They intentionally put freeways through the black community to disrupt the black business districts. In New Orleans, there was a big park in New Orleans where black people used to congregate and hang out with their families. And the city, when they were deciding where to build their freeway, because all of these black businesses had grown up around this park, they built the freeway right through the center of that park, destroying the black business community. So it was done time after time after time on purpose. In fact, in Milwaukee, the path of Interstate 43 was originally supposed to be right up through the heart of 16th Street in Milwaukee. They moved it further east, right up through the heart of 6th Street, because that's where the black residential district was. It was done intentionally. All right, section 982. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. So it impacted our school systems as well. So we created, with these policies, huge gaps in home ownership rates from 1934 to 1962. Federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing from 1930 to 1950. 98% of FHA loans only went to white people. So this is what they did. I tell white people all the time, you don't understand, and there's a book you should read, When Affirmative Action Was White. To look at all of the advantageous things that were done to uplift whites economically and to make sure that blacks and other people of color did not have those same advantages. One of the things that was done was to help white people build generational wealth. Most American wealth is in the homes that you own. It's not in your bank account, your 401k, the bitcoins that somebody suckered you into buying a couple of years ago. It's in your home. That's where most American wealth is. And by building communities of whites who had the ability to buy homes, it not only created wealth for them, but it created generational wealth that they could pass down to their children and grandchildren. I know several of my white friends, their first home was a home that they got from their parents or their grandparents. I don't know a single black person like that. So this was a system that perpetuated inequalities and created the gap in home ownership that we continue to see to this day. From 1947 to 1953, the federal government really helped to build our suburbs. I tell people that if you look at the suburbs around most major cities, you look at the dates of incorporation for most of those cities, you will find that many of them were created in the 1950s as a result of the federal government saying, hey, look, we have a boatload of billions of dollars over here. We'll help you build a brand new community away from that central city. Come on over here and build a house. We'll build a freeway to help you get there. We'll build an electrical grid for it. We'll build a sewage system for it. We'll hook you up, white people, as long as you make sure black people and other people who are inharmonious don't come out to those communities. That's what the federal government did. And I tell people that the money that they used was money that took away from central cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. They took money that used to go to those central cities, diverted it out to building those very comfortable, nice, lily white suburbs for white people. This is why the white ownership rate is what it is today. They got the straight hookup. How many of you guys remember the homeboy hookup? Homeboy hookup, anybody remember that? In Living Color, come on now. Anybody remember In Living Color, homeboy hookup? Well, the homeboy hookup was the white people. That's how you got where you are economically. There's other things. That book, When Affirmative Action Was White, will tell you some of those other things. 3.5 million suburban homes were insured by the federal government from 1947 to 1953. 650,000 suburban rental properties, but only 29,386 houses for non-whites around the entire country. So they were hooking up white people and making sure that people of color did not have those benefits. Between 1948 and 1958, 85% of the new homes built in the United States were located in the suburbs. So when I tell people that white flight was not about the civil unrest that was happening, was not about the growth of black population in those cities, the reason white people left those cities, because they had somewhere else to go. If black people could have moved to the suburbs, they would have gone too. Who wouldn't want to move to a brand new community with a brand new house that's way cheaper than the house in the city? Everybody with a decent brain would have wanted to do that. But the only people who were afforded that opportunity, for the most part, were white people. The National Association of Real Estate Boards, they chimed in. From 1926 to 1950, they steered people to different neighborhoods by putting Article 34 in their Bible, their code of ethics. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property occupancy. Members of any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence would clearly be detrimental to property values in their neighborhood, even though they knew it was a lie. They knew that when those inharmonious racial groups moved in, that the property values did not go down. In fact, they went up astronomically. This is what happened. People that were known as blockbusters went into white communities and said, well, you know, some of those people are moving close by, only a few blocks away. They're going to be here on your block soon. You better sell while you can before your property values go down. So they scared white people into taking the house that was worth $10,000, selling it to them for $5,000. Then they turned around and sold it to somebody else for $30,000 or $40,000. And then that black family who moved in as a renter, or if they were black and they couldn't get a traditional mortgage, they had to buy on a land contract. The way land contracts work was that you paid somebody month after month after month, year after year after year, until you paid it off. But if you missed the payment, you were late on the payment, they told you one of two things. If you were dealing with somebody nice and you missed the payment, or you were late and you were on the land contract, they said, well, sorry, Mr. Jackson, you missed the payment last month. I'm going to have you start over from scratch. I'm like, but I've been paying you consistently. I've never missed a payment in 7 years. They're like, well, thank you, I appreciate that, but you have to start all over from scratch. That's if you're dealing with somebody nice. If you're dealing with someone who isn't nice, what they're going to say is, sorry, Mr. Jackson, you paid us, and you've never missed a payment, you've never been late for the last 10 years. I really appreciate that, but because you missed the payment last month, I have to evict you and your family from this home. And then they turn around and use that same policy on someone else. So the property values went up. Those new communities that opened up for blacks and Latinos and other inharmonious racial groups, they became overcrowded because now they moved in to rent that house that was basically, say, $100 a month. Guess what? When they moved in, they raised the rent to $300 or $400 a month. So now one family can't afford the rent. Now you have to have 2 or 3 families move in. And the landlords did not take care of the property. They disintegrated. That's why the neighborhood property values went down. Not because the people that moved there didn't take care of the properties. It's because the person who sold it to them could care less about the condition of the property as long as they were getting paid. That's why the property values went down, not because black people moved into the neighborhood. In fact, you would have been happy to have a black person moved in if you were one of these speculators, because you would have made billions of dollars across the country using that policy. Blockbusting, as I just told you, this was from an article that said, would you panic if a Negro moved next door? And so they're asking people, what would you do? So, housing discrimination against black GIs. How many of you have served in the military? I served in the Navy for 6 years, and I had no idea how poorly black GIs were treated when they came back from fighting in World War II. Two of my mother's uncles served in World War II. My great-grandfather served in World War I. I served for 6 years in the military. My father served in the Air Force. I served in the Navy. There's a tradition of military service in my family, but I had no idea that black GIs were treated so poorly. So if we look at veterans housing, so as these veterans are coming to these different bases around the country, they didn't have places for them to live on the bases because they simply hadn't built enough housing. So they started to build communities to house these veterans. And unfortunately, for every 4 units being constructed for white veterans, only 1 was built for Negro veterans. Although the ratio of white to Negro veterans was 2 to 1. So once again, they hooked up the white folks to the detriment of blacks, and they ended up doubling up, tripling up their families in those veteran housing projects. The GI Bill, we've been told it was this great thing that the federal government created to honor all of those veterans who served in World War II, and they came back and they gave them several different advantages in life. They told them that you could go to school, technical school, college for free. You could get a VA guaranteed loan to get a house. It was a wonderful program, but what they didn't tell you in your history class was that it didn't work the same for the black GIs who came back. And the reason it didn't was because of the way the bill was written. The bill was written with colorblind language, but when you give control of those programs to states like Mississippi and Alabama and Virginia and Kentucky and Florida and Texas, those white folks back then were not going to treat those black folks the same as they treated those white GIs. In fact, many black GIs who came back from fighting in World War I were actually lynched in their uniforms. There are over a dozen documented cases of black GIs coming back from fighting in World War I who were literally lynched in their uniforms. So the GI Bill was supposed to help these GIs, but it really didn't help all of them. Most black veterans were blocked from access due to discrimination, redlining, and lack of access to college. 19 states maintain separate colleges and universities for black students. Many private colleges and universities outside the South only had a formal quota system of just a handful of blacks. How many of you know how many states broke away from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America in 1861? Anybody want to guess? You guys didn't pay attention in history class, I can tell. Or maybe you did, you probably just had a bad history teacher like I had when I was in school. And you don't remember there were 11 states that formed the Confederate States of America. There were 15 slaving states, 11 of those 15 broke away, 4 stayed as part of the Union. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to those 4 states, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the slaves in those states. So when people tell you that Lincoln freed the slaves, tell them he didn't free the slaves in those 4 slaving states that didn't form the Confederacy or didn't join the Confederacy. In addition to that, you can see that more than 11 states had separate colleges and universities for blacks and whites. So there were 8 additional states that were just as bad as Mississippi and Alabama and the other states we love to put all of the blame on for being racist. At the conclusion of World War II, blacks wanting to attend colleges in the South were restricted in their choices to about 100 public and private institutions that were known as colleges for Negroes. And across all private and public institutions in the South, white institutions accounted for 92% of the total expenditures by the states. 92% of money for education institutions in the South were for white institutions. Now, listen, this may sound controversial, but I love to say this because it's absolutely accurate. We talk about historically black colleges and universities. We need to start talking about historically white colleges and universities as well. Because these are the places that black people weren't allowed to go. My mother's uncles couldn't go to Ole Miss when they came back from serving in World War II. They couldn't go to Mississippi State. How many of you guys saw who won the college basketball championship recently? Which team won? Anybody remember? Virginia. Guess what? Back when my mother's uncles came back from World War II, they couldn't have gone to University of Virginia. Who won the football championship? Alabama. They certainly were not going to go to the University of Alabama. So when we talk about colleges and universities, we have to understand that for decade after decade, black GIs were not able to go to those colleges. A survey of historically black colleges in 1945 found that 45% of institutions enrolled fewer than 250 students, and 92% of the institutions had enrollment of less than 1,000. So even if these black GIs wanted to go to college, there was not many places they could go. there were not enough seats in those HBCUs for them to even go to, and as a result, most of them did not have the opportunity. And looking at those HBCUs, 1 out of 9 selected had 7 of them needed housing, additional housing, 3 lacked classroom space, 1 lacked recreational facilities, 3 needed equipment, supplies, and textbooks, and 1 has limited allotments. So those Negro colleges, they were called, but really not places that were the best places for blacks to go and get educated. They improved over the course of time, and over the course of time, if you look at the data, it shows that 85% of blacks in the country today who have a doctorate degree, 85% who have a doctorate degree did their undergrad work at a historically black college and or university. You know why? Because there they push you if you're black. If you go to a historically white college or university, they're not going to push you to go to grad school. But at the black ones, they're going to push you if they think you're eligible and able. So these are some of the limited opportunities. Negro veterans will continue to live in substandard dwellings until they're economically able to participate equally. Restricted covenants should be abolished. This is a group that wrote a document called Our Negro Veterans. A discriminatory mortgage rate should be equalized. Greater quantities of low-cost housing and prefabricated houses should be made available to Negro veterans. And they also say Negro colleges are neither well-equipped nor numerous enough to meet the demands of Negro veterans. And quota systems in most colleges limit the number of Negroes attending. So they were saying, and this document was written back in 1946. So they were telling people, these are the issues. This is why these GIs will not be able to have the benefits of the GI Bill the way whites will. And if you look at the data, the World War II veterans receiving a bachelor's degree with the GI Bill. Those who were born in 1920, 6% of the white ones received a bachelor's degree. 0% of the black GIs born in 1920 got a bachelor's degree with the GI Bill. 21% of whites born in 1921, 0% of blacks. 10% of white GIs born in 1922 got a bachelor's degree. 5% of blacks. 13% of whites born in 1923 who were GIs got a bachelor's degree. 0 of the blacks. In 1920, those born in 1924, 14% of whites and 10% of black GIs born that year received a bachelor's degree. 1925, 15% of whites born that year and only 5% of black GIs born that year received a bachelor's degree. And then from 1926 to 1927, 12% of whites, 12% of whites, 15% of whites, and then 3% of whites versus 0% of black GIs. So the GI Bill did not help everybody equally, contrary to what it tells you in your civics and history textbook. So 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed supposedly to end housing discrimination on a federal level. George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, created a program called Open Communities, and he said, any community that's discriminating in housing, we will cut you off from federal funding for any big projects, a highway project, a water project, electrical grid project, whatever it is, we'll cut you off as long as you continue to discriminate. And those communities called the White House. They talked to the president's staff and President Nixon, even though he knew that this was the law of the land. This law that we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of last year, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. I tell people, be careful what you celebrate, because this is the first effort on the part of the federal government to enforce it. And a year later, this is what President Nixon said: I am absolutely opposed to this program. He went a step further and he said, knock it in the head now. And they killed the program. And the federal government has never reinstituted a program of that magnitude to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act. So stop celebrating stuff without knowing the ramifications of what happened after the law passed. Another thing that we celebrate, and I'm going to digress for a moment, we celebrate the March on Washington, right? August 28, 1963. How many of you are aware that just 28 days later is when that church in Birmingham was bombed and 15 kids were injured and 4 little girls lost their lives? So we celebrate the March on Washington like it was a turning point in American history, but in the minds of those people in Alabama, it was business as usual, because Birmingham was known by black residents as Birmingham. So this is what President Nixon said in 1972 about his opposition to fair housing. I'm convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, that forced integration of housing and education is just as wrong. I realize that this position will lead us to a situation in which blacks will continue to live for the most part in black neighborhoods and where there will be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools. That's the President of the United States. basically just slapping the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act in the face and saying, I don't care what it says. I don't care that it's the law of the land. I don't like it. Therefore, I will not support it by not instituting a policy that enforces it. So, like I tell people, laws are useless if they are not enforced. These policies created a two-tier system of home ownership that still exists to this day. Despite all of these laws on the federal, state, local level, we still have tremendous amounts of discrimination. Black home ownership rate in 1968 at the end of the year was 41.2% nationally. And I just updated this at the end of 2018, it had grown to 42.9%. Progress. Progress. We've come a long way. No, we haven't. All right, black versus white home ownership rates nationwide. The white home ownership rate at the end of 2018, 73.6%. For blacks, 42.9%. And this is what it looks like in terms of the gap between black and white home ownership rate here in southeast Wisconsin. The gap between blacks and whites in Kenosha is a 54% or 54-point gap. 54-point gap. In Waukesha, 46.9% gap. Racine, 45.7% gap. Walworth County, 41.3% gap. Washington County, 36.8% gap. Milwaukee County, 33.2% gap. And Ozaukee County, 12.6% gap. These gaps exist because of what I've just shared with you about decades of policies that hooked up white people and made sure that black people didn't have those same advantages. It has nothing to do with black people not being credit worthy or not being responsible and all those other things that you hear people say. It is not about that. It's about decade after decade of banks and other lenders, the federal government, the real estate industry really promoting white home ownership and denying people of color those same opportunities around the country. Here's a study that was done looking at housing discrimination where they send out testers. So they send out mixed pairs of testers to go and see if they can rent or buy a home, right? So to inquire about it. And they send these people out. This is the way the Housing and Urban Development does these studies to see how much discrimination is taking place. So this was a study that was done using over 8,000 testers in 28 metropolitan areas. And so what they found when they sent them out was that blacks were told about units when they were looking to rent. They were told about units 11.4% less than whites were. In terms of being shown units, 4.2% fewer units were shown to blacks. When they were talking about buying it, 17% less blacks were told about homes, and 17.7% less blacks were shown homes. Now remember, these people that they sent out had the absolutely exact same credentials. Nothing was different about them other than the color of their skin. Same credentials, they were dressed alike, they comported themselves in the same way. They trained these people to go out to be basically mirrors of each other with just different skin color. And you could see that the blacks were treated differently, the Hispanics were treated differently. For those rental units, 12.5% less were told about units that were available. 7.5% less were shown units that were available for Asians. 9.8% less were told about units. 6.6% less were shown units. And in terms of looking at houses, for whites and Hispanics, it was about the same, so there was no noticeable difference there. But when it came to Asians who were looking for homes, 15.5% less Asians were told about homes that were available, and 18.8% less Asians were shown homes that were available. So this discrimination covers a variety of different groups. It's not just blacks, but many people of color are the victims of this discrimination that continues unabated. Wells Fargo. If you're banking at Wells Fargo, I'm sure you heard some bad stuff about them over the last couple of years. They've been in the news. But you probably don't remember this from 2012. They had to settle with the federal government because they were offering different terms for black and white people who were getting mortgages through them. In addition to that, Countrywide Financial was doing the exact same thing. So Wells Fargo set up for $175 million in 2012, and Countrywide Financial sell for $335 million in 2015, the largest ever settlement of housing discrimination. This is what they did. They ensured that those black people who were eligible for prime loans got a subprime loan instead. And let me tell you people, I hear all of these people telling me, these people were irresponsible, getting those subprime loans, they knew they couldn't afford them, blah, 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 blah. I can guarantee you that if you're honest, any of you that has purchased a home, raise your hand. If when they gave you that stack of paper this thick, raise your hand if you read every one of those pages. Raise your hand. 2 people. 2 people. You must be attorneys to even understand the language. Are you 2 attorneys? Because I tried reading a couple pages, I was like, man, this is not going to work. I'm going to just have to trust these people. But guess what those documents do not say? They do not say prime loan or subprime loan. Nobody even knew what a subprime loan was before they started going into default. And these people who were black and Hispanic were given subprime loans even though they had the same credit worthiness as white people. And the people who were underwriting the loans got a fatter commission. This is what they did. You were selling a home that was $240,000 home, right? You get a commission for a prime loan, your commission is $1,200. That's pretty good commission, right? Yeah. But if you offer that same person a subprime loan instead, your commission is $7,500. Wow. Which one are you going to take? $1,200 or $7,500? Most people took $7,500 and they got caught with their hands in the cookie jar because they were doing this all over the country. So, like I told you earlier, our wealth is in our homes. So this is the average equity in a home owned by an Asian person, $154,000 in equity. For non-Hispanic whites, about $96,000 in equity. For Hispanics, about $60,000 in equity. And for the average black, about $59,000 in equity. So you see huge disparities there. In addition to that, the median net worth for Asians is $156,500. For non-Hispanic whites, $130,800. Hispanics, $17,530. And for blacks, $9,590 median net worth. And that's primarily because of lower values of homes those people have. Median family income in 2016 for the average white, non-Hispanic white, $80,000 family income. For blacks, $49,000. American Indians, $50,000. Asians, $96,000. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, $67,950, and $56,000 for Hispanics. Now, the reason that that Asians are at the top of the list is because they are the most educated Americans in the country. They are much more likely to have a bachelor's degree than any other group. One of the things I want to share with you is how this impacts our ability to work, right? So in Milwaukee, we have a huge issue with where the jobs are being created are not in the city of Milwaukee. We're losing jobs in the city of Milwaukee. People have to go out to the suburbs and mostly even out to the exurban counties. They have to go out to Waukesha County. They have to go out to Ozaukee County, Washington County, which is where the growth in jobs is occurring in the Milwaukee metropolitan area. So what happens is you see a huge disparity in terms of where black people live and where they work. And I see similar disparities here in Racine. So I want to show you. You can see here the percentage of residents, but now I want to show you the percentage of people who are Racine residents who work in Racine. This will shock you. Whites are 50.2% of the residents, but they have 84.7% of the jobs in the city of Racine. Blacks are 22% of the population in the city, but only have 11.9% of the jobs in the city. Asians are 1.1% of the population, only have 1.7% of the jobs. Latinos are 23% of the population, yet they only have 9% of the jobs in the city of Racine. Native Americans, 0.3% of the population, 0.4% of the workers. Now this data comes from a tool that the Census Bureau has called Census on the Map. It's one of my favorite toys to play with. You can look at a great deal of things there. You can look at the types of jobs that each community has. You can look at the pay that those jobs offer. You can look at different sectors. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. But this is something that I want to share with you to show, because in Milwaukee, just by example, in Milwaukee, whites are 37% of the population in the city, but they have 74% of the jobs in the city. Wow. Blacks are 40% of the population in the city of Milwaukee, they only have 20% of the jobs. Latinos are 17.3% of the population in the city of Milwaukee, they only have 8% of the jobs. So there's huge disparities, and those disparities continue to grow as we continue to see jobs grow outside of central cities. Current impediments to fair housing. These are from the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council. They have identified a lack of required enforcement mechanism for complaints of discrimination. Listen, if you don't have a mechanism in place that people can go and file a complaint and have that process work out for them, then it doesn't matter if you have a law. The laws are useless if people don't know or have the ability to go and file those complaints. Affordable housing supply, that is an incredibly important issue. I've been doing some consulting work with the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, also known as Sewer PAC, and they've drafted this huge document that the book is like this thick. They're like, Reggie, here's some nighttime reading for you. But it has some great data in it, and it looks at some suggestions they make about things that we can do to kind of alleviate some of the issues of segregation and the poverty that comes along with it. And one of the things they talk about is building more affordable housing. In Milwaukee, and I haven't looked at the data here in Racine, in Milwaukee, this is what happens. Communities are refusing to build affordable housing for families. They're required to build affordable housing. So how they get around the law is they say, we'll build affordable housing for senior citizens. And guess what? If you're building affordable housing for senior citizens in New Berlin, you're not going to have somebody from 3rd and North Avenue in Milwaukee traveling to New Berlin as a senior to live in that senior housing. So if you look at all of the federally mandated and funded affordable housing units in the Milwaukee metropolitan area, all of the family affordable housing units are in the city of Milwaukee, with the exception of one in Oak Creek. And almost all of the affordable housing units for seniors are outside of the city of Milwaukee. So those suburban communities are building plenty of affordable housing units, but they're doing it for seniors only, in the process keeping poor families out of those communities. The lending gap, like I said, even though people have the same credit worthiness, the lending gap is tremendous because of discrimination. Suburban policies which require houses to be a certain size. You can't build a little bitty house. You can't build a house that's close together. You have these laws that require houses to be a certain size. You have laws that require it to be certain density. So houses have to be a certain distance apart. Those things are what's creating pockets in suburban communities where people who are not of higher economic and social status can move to those communities. Mortgage lending discrimination. Even though it's against the law, even though the federal government tracks this thing, one of the things that happened recently, unfortunately, is there was a law that was put in place to force all lenders to keep track of the demographics of people that they give loans to for houses. Well, when the Trump administration took over, anybody remember who was in charge of housing and urban development underneath them? A brain surgeon! Ben Carson. And one of the things that he did was eliminated that rule. Housing Employment Discrimination Ordinance, like I said, if you don't have ordinances or if they're not strong enough, they're not worth the paper they're written on. All right, so let's look at some of the negative demographics. This is actually a picture of a guy I met in Milwaukee. I want to tell you his story. His name is Dave. He has a twin brother. I met him one day. I'm driving not far from my house. He was pushing this metal cart with all of these recyclable materials on it. And I pulled over, and I'm dressed, I think I may have had the same tie on. And I pulled over and I said, sir, can I talk to you for a moment? He's like, sure. So I said, what's up with the cart? Tell me about the cart you have. And he says, well, me and my brother, we both lost our jobs within the last month. And we're struggling to pay our bills. We get a little money from the state, for food share, which is food stamps. But beyond that, we have other bills to pay, electric bill and other things. So this is how we make extra money to kind of support ourselves until we're back on our feet and we have a job again. He says my brother is disabled and he always has trouble finding jobs. So it's going to be even harder for him to find a job. And he says they get up every morning, Monday through Saturday at 4 a.m. and they travel around with separate carts, going through alleys, looking for recyclables, and they take them to multiple recycling places not far from where I live. And that's how they pay their bills. And I looked at this guy, Dave, and I'm like, wow, Dave, that's an amazing story. Then I looked at his shirt, and I'm like, he has a shirt on with an American flag on it, proud American. And I asked myself, as I was leaving, he said, sir, let me ask you, what are you running for office or something? I said, no, I just wanted to talk to you, Dave. Thank you for sharing with me. Not yet. And I said, speaking of that, let me tell you guys something. I've had people tell me I should run for office.
Hey.
People have told me I should run for alderman, for mayor, for governor, and last week somebody told me I should run for president.
Come on.
I'm running for social justice. That's what I'm running for. That's what I believe. So, let me finish telling you about David. I guarantee you, thousands of people drive past David and his brother every day, and this is probably what they say about David and his brother. Look at those bums. Why don't they get a job like the rest of us lazy behinds? Look at them. Just collecting money for nothing. These two men work harder than 90% of the people in this room, I'm sure. How many of you going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and collect recyclables till 6 in the evening, 6 days a week? Not many people. This is how this man is surviving. He and his brother. There are a lot of people in this condition. There are millions of Americans who won't admit this. But there's a huge group of Americans known as the working poor. They're working a full-time job, 40 hours a week or more, and they still can't pay their bills. And you know why they can't? Because the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It hasn't been changed in 9 years. It's lower than it was adjusted for inflation. It was higher in 1970. American productivity rate since 1970 has increased exponentially. Our American workers are way more productive than we've ever been in the nation's history, but our wages have been dropping for the last 60 years adjusted for inflation. That doesn't age you by today isn't what it cost in 1975. Your wages have not kept up with your bills. How many of you would be willing to do this? You go to the grocery store and you take that bill to your boss and say, boss, 2 months ago when I bought this gallon of eggs, it was $2.85. It's $3.15 now. Can I get a raise? What would your boss say? They would probably laugh at you, right? But this is the condition people are in. We are seeing a huge growth in poverty. And let me tell you, white people, this is a warning for you all. The fastest growing rate of poverty is among white people. The fastest growing rate of poverty in terms of what community are in our suburbs. The fastest growing rate of suicide are in the white community. The fastest growing rate of drug addiction, particularly the opioid addiction, is among white people. Last year, for the first time in American history, white life expectancy decreased. It's never happened before. The things that white people are beginning to deal with today are the things that black and brown people have been dealing with for hundreds of years. We in the black community have an old saying, we know how to make $1 out of 15 cents. White people, y'all better start learning how to make $1 out of 15 cents. Because we, as an economy, we love to give raises to CEOs. The average CEO back in 1970 was making about 8 times more than the average American worker. Today, it's over 400 times more than the average American worker. We're giving huge tax breaks to billionaires. We just gave hundreds of millions of dollars to the billionaire owners of the Milwaukee Bucks to build the beautiful Fiserv Forum. I've been in there for a Bucks game. It's a fabulous place. But I was mad because I'm like, man, I'm paying for it out of my tax dollars, but I can't just come anytime I feel like it. But I've given them $160 for a ticket for me and my wife. So we are doing most Americans a huge disservice. We don't recognize it. But we better start paying attention because the things that we're beginning to see, the things that are dividing us, are things that are related to the economy, people. And for those of you young people in the room, I hate to share this with you, but according to the U.S. Department of Labor, those of you who are 18 to 24-year-olds across every racial group, you are the first generation, since they've been keeping track over 100 years, that are guaranteed to make less money during your lifetime than your parents made. So you know what young people are telling those of us who are older? You've sold us a bill of goods. You lied to us. We've been bamboozled. We've been hoodwinked. We're not happy. So when you see the disenchantment among millennials, they're literally telling you, listen, Why is it that you told us that me going to college would be the opportunity of my lifetime, and I graduate from college, I can't find a job in my field, and now I have $80,000, $120,000 in college debt, student loan debt that I'll never pay off, and I can file bankruptcy and take everything off, credit cards, all kinds of stuff, but I can't take those student loans off.
That's right.
There are $6 trillion of student loan debt today, and it's growing exponentially every day. We need to do something about it. Not for the sake of us, my age, but for the young people, because I'm telling you, there will be a revolution, and it will not be televised. Racine area poverty rates. In the county, 11.9%. City, Racine, 20% poverty rate. Blacks in Racine, 31.9% poverty rate. Hispanics in Racine, 26.5% poverty rate. Whites in Racine, 15.4% poverty rate. American Indians in Racine, 10.5% poverty rate. Asians in Racine, just under 1% poverty rate. The national average is 14.6%. Those are the bachelor's degree. Part of the reason those poverty rates are so different is because you have differential outcomes in our school system. So blacks in Racine, only 5.1% of blacks in Racine have a bachelor's degree. 6.4% of Hispanics do, 23.8% of whites do, 5.6% of American Indians do, and 64.2% of Asians in Racine have a bachelor's degree. So I used to be a teacher. I was a teacher for 8 years. And we used to always tell our students, get your education. Get your education. That's the path to the future. But when we tell young people that nowadays, they're like, from what I heard, Mr. Jackson, what my mama said was, she went and got her degree, and she can't even find a job, Mr. Jackson. And now she's got all of these student loan debts, and that's why we can't go to Great America this summer. Right? It's impacting a lot of people, I'm telling you. It's a huge problem, and we need to do a better job in this state. Listen, we do not value higher education in Wisconsin. We used to. We used to be a model for other states. The UW system used to be a model. UW system and the University of California system were models for the rest of the country, but now we're laughed at. And you know why people are laughing at Wisconsin? Because we're one of only 7 states that now spends more money on its corrections budget than it does on the UW system. There's something seriously wrong with that equation. Somebody's doing some very bad math that they think it's more valuable to build prisons than to put money into our education system. And I hate to talk about our former governor, but when I was a teacher, he started taking money out of the education budgets, which really hurt a lot of those of us who were teachers. And then right before the last election, he put some money back in and said he was the education candidate. Let me tell you what Malcolm X said years ago. Malcolm X said, you can't stick a knife 10 inches into a man's back, pull it out 2 inches, and say you made progress. You can't pull the wool over my eyes, people. It doesn't work. All right. Unemployment rate. Blacks in Racine in 2017, 13.4%. Hispanics, 7.7%. Whites, 7.6%. Racine is very similar to Milwaukee in terms of the shifts in their economy. Both of us were kind of industrial-based manufacturing cities that depended on big manufacturers. And guess what? They went away, right? They went away. And let me tell you, they're not coming back. They can tell you Foxconn is going to create 13,000 jobs. But if you check the math, how many have they created so far? The last I heard from the article in the Journal Center was 82. That's it. At some office building that they bought in Milwaukee. 82. And people have been literally spying on that building. People are on buildings across the street with binoculars trying to look in the window to see if there are literally people inside working. And they're like, man, ain't nobody in there. So they're not coming back. All right, estimated percentage of households that are owner-occupied. You can see the disparities. The lighter colors are home ownership rates that are 30, 40%, and then the ones that are darker, anywhere from 40 to 61% or more. And you can see it's not the same around the entire region. There are huge disparities in home ownership rates. And what's interesting about this is if I was to take that redlining map from 1937, put it right on top of that, you would see that it matches very closely with that because it does the same in Milwaukee. All right, disparities in incarceration. We as a state incarcerate black men at the highest rate of any state in the country. We have to understand, though, that mass incarceration is different than what people have been telling. I'm working on a series that I call the 2.2 million, the history and human cost of mass incarceration. I've done some previews of that for several places. I just did it in Madison a week and a half ago. I plan to come here and do it sometime very soon. So when you see it on the calendar, make sure you come out, because I have a different take on mass incarceration. I look at it from the perspective of people have been telling us something that's true, but it's really misleading. You've heard during your entire lives that black people are about 12% of the population in the U.S. and they're about 40% of the prison population, right? However, the last time I checked, there were no 3-month-old black boys in prison, no 7-year-old black boys in prison, not a whole lot of 95-year-old black men in prison. Over 90% of the people who are in prison in this country are 18 to 55-year-olds. So if you look, black males 18 to 55 only make up 3% of the population of the United States of America. But they make up over 40% of the people incarcerated. So you tell me, is it possible that 3% of the population can commit 40% of the crime? Does that even make sense? If you look at our system, that's what our system is telling us. So 18 to 55-year-olds are a majority of the prisoners. But if we look, 18-year-old and older blacks, that includes 18 up to 107, only 2% of the population in the state of Wisconsin, but account for nearly 43% of our prisoners. 2% of the population looks like me. 43% of the prison population looks like me. Huge disparity. This is a map I created last year. These are all 72 counties in Wisconsin. The red counties, those counties, 10% or more of the black residents at the end of 2014 were either in a prison or a jail. 23 of the 72 counties, 10% or more of the black residents were in a prison or a jail. And like I told you earlier, these places that they're incarcerated in or their new homes, they're counted as residents of those communities. There are 56 predominantly black neighborhoods in the state, 31 are jails or prisons. There are 15 cities where the only black neighborhood is a jail. I went up to Green Bay a number of years ago to do a presentation on the history of blacks in Green Bay. And one of the things that I shared with them was the shifting demographics of that county. And I showed them how the black population had increased pretty dramatically. And some of the people were like, oh my goodness, that's great, that's wonderful. We're becoming a more diverse community. And I said, hold your horses. Many of those people are locked up in one of the prisons in that county. They're not living next door to you, buddy. So that doesn't mean that your neighborhood is becoming more diverse. It means the community is, because you built prisons. In fact, the state of Wisconsin has built, since I graduated from high school, June of 1983, the state of Wisconsin has built 23 correctional institutions, including the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility, which is right on 10th and Highland, right next to the freeway in Milwaukee. Looks like a big office building. Looks like it has windows, but there are none. Built in 2001 for $58 million. Was supposed to house people for a maximum of 90 days as they were being held after their conviction before they went and were assigned to a state prison. They're supposed to be held there a maximum of 90 days. 2 months after they finished building it and opened it, they changed the policy and they said people be held there indefinitely. And it became a state prison instead of just a holding pen. On any given day, over 1,000 people are in that facility. At one time they had 1,400. It was designed to hold a maximum of 580 people. The annual budget for the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility is $39 million per year. 18 people have died inside of it since they built it in 2001. There's been a campaign called Close MSDF that I've been assisting people in getting the word out. Our new governor promised during his campaign to close the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Because one of the first things he did was say, well, I'm not going to close it. I'm going to put some money into making it a better place, a more comfortable place for people. That's not what anybody asked you to do. That's not what you said you were going to do. You said you were going to cut the prison population in half. But your first budget actually puts money into 844 additional prison beds. I tell people this all the time. Don't listen to what the politicians tell you. Follow what they do. So after you vote, this is what I want all of you to do. After each election, they hang that little sticker that says I voted. Tell them I don't want that sticker. I want you to create a sticker that says this: I voted, and I'm going to keep a close eye on everything you did. Because that's what an informed voter is. Not just somebody goes in and puts a name in a box, checks a name, and then doesn't pay any attention to what those elected officials do. You have to pay attention to what they do. And guess what? I know just about every elected official in the city of Milwaukee. And let me tell you one thing about elected officials. Mr. Mayor, you know this is true. Elected officials pay attention to people that pay attention to them. So the people that are calling them, texting them, emailing them, actually physically picking up a piece of paper and a pen and writing a letter, which young people apparently don't know how to do anymore, putting the stamp on it, putting that envelope in the mailbox, they pay attention. They keep a database of who contacts them, because those are the people that are holding them accountable. If you're not one of those people, become one of those people that harasses them, because guess what? When they're out at a public event and they see you, they're like, hey, Mr. Jackson, thanks for that email. Thanks for the 7 texts you sent. Appreciated that letter, Mr. Jackson. I'm on it. Because if you're not one of those people, they're going to do whatever they want to do. We elect them to represent us. Yes. They don't represent themselves, but we don't hold them accountable. Start holding them accountable. All right, so benefits of importing prisoners, like I said, they are counted as residents of those communities. They are counted for representation in our state government, and in the amount of money that they get from the state government increases by having these prisoners. These counties, more than half of the black residents at the end of 2014 were either in jail or prison. I'm going to just read a few of these to you. In Fond du Lac County, there were 276 blacks incarcerated. Only 29 blacks in the entire county who were not incarcerated. Washara County, 391 incarcerated blacks living in the county, 63 non-incarcerated blacks living in the county. Jackson County, 344 incarcerated blacks, 56 non-incarcerated blacks. Dodge County, 2,031 incarcerated blacks, 350 non-incarcerated blacks. So when I tell you that mass incarceration of black people in Wisconsin is the worst of any state, it's worse than you think. Yeah. In fact, mass incarceration, we hear that Wisconsin has the highest incarceration rate for black males, but if we include black females also, we have the second highest incarceration rate for blacks overall. The only state that has a higher rate is the state of Oklahoma. So this is a major issue. What can you do? Let me give you some things that you can do. Lobby your elected officials to enforce the open housing laws. Like I said, these laws are useless if we don't enforce them. And if we're not paying attention to whether or not they're being enforced, we're not supporting those laws. The Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council is the single most effective fair housing council in the entire United States of America. They've done a better job than any other one, despite the fact that they're poorly funded, that they're poorly staffed. They do a tremendous job. We need to put more money into making sure that housing discrimination is a thing of the past. Let's not live on the laurels of the 1968 Fair Housing Act or the 1968 Fair Housing Marches in Milwaukee that helped us to pass a local ordinance. Let me tell you what happened in Milwaukee after the 200 days of marching in 1967 and 1968. You guys familiar with the story? March across 6th Street Viaduct to open up the south side of Milwaukee. These blacks, Father Grappi, Vale Phillips, the NAACP Youth Council marched for 200 consecutive days across the 6th Street Viaduct to open up the south side as well as the north side of Milwaukee, because blacks couldn't live north of Capitol Drive in Milwaukee in 1960. There were only 3 blacks living north of Capitol Drive in the entire metropolitan area, and one of them was Hank Aaron. And he struggled to get a house in the North Shore, even though he was the most famous athlete in the country. So, let me tell you what happened. They marched for 200 consecutive days. That first day, they were met by an angry mob of 5,000 whites on the other end of that bridge who were throwing rocks, bricks, bottles, bags of urine, bags of feces, yelling every racial epithet you can imagine, telling them to go back home. We don't want you in our communities. And the police were there in very sparse numbers. But those people came back the next day, and the crowd of angry whites grew to 13,000. But guess what? They kept on marching for 200 consecutive days, and finally the city of Milwaukee passed the federal fair housing local ordinance, and shortly thereafter the federal government, a week after Dr. King's assassination, passed the Federal Fair Housing Act. But this is what happened in Milwaukee. I looked at a special census done in Milwaukee in 1975. I wanted to see the impact on the south side of Milwaukee. How many blacks had actually moved to the south side of Milwaukee as a result of that fair housing ordinance in those 200 days of march? And I said this to people who were members of that.
Please. The public library will be closing promptly in 15 minutes. If you have any materials to check out, please do so now.
I said this to people who were some of those marchers, and I told them, I said, thank you for what you did, the sacrifices you made. It was wonderful, but it didn't work. It didn't work to open up the south side, because 8 years later, in 1975, those neighborhoods on the south side, most of them still had single digits of black residents. Even by the late 80s, they still had single digit black residents. In fact, blacks didn't start to move to the south side of Milwaukee until whites started leaving certain neighborhoods and were displaced by Hispanics. Once those neighborhoods became majority Hispanics, then blacks moved into the neighborhoods. So I tell people, always be very careful what you celebrate, because it's not celebrating that particular thing. You should be looking at the effectiveness of it as well. So, create a community that welcomes newcomers of all races and socioeconomic groups. We are a diverse nation. We're becoming more diverse. Part of the reason we're becoming more diverse is because certain groups of people in our country, particularly Asians and Latinos, are having children at a higher rate than any other group. Not because they're doing something different than anybody else. The reason that they're growing at a faster rate than anybody else is because they have a higher percentage of women of childbearing age of any other group in the country. That's why they're having more babies and they're growing at a faster rate. It has nothing to do with immigration. Even if we put a wall, listen, we can build this wall, which isn't going to stop anybody, by the way. But even if we built it, the ones that are here already, people, they're not going to stop having children. They're not going to stop being 18 to 24-year-old women. They're going to continue to be 18 to 24-year-old women. They continue to have a higher growth rate, and those populations will continue to grow. We'll continue to be a diverse country. The Census Bureau tells us that, I believe it's this year, for the first time in our history, a majority of children born in this country will be children of color. First time ever. Get used to it, people. That's the reality of the world we're living in, and if you don't like it, and you can't get used to it, you better teach your children and grandchildren to like it and get used to it, because it is what it is. The numbers do not lie. So, also, understand the concentrated poverty caused by segregation impacts the tax base of the city and county. I don't know if you have this problem here, but we have a huge problem in Milwaukee with potholes. I mean, they're everywhere. And man, every time I have to dodge a pothole, every time I run over a pothole, I'm really angry, because I realize that the reason we have those potholes and we can't fix them, because we're constantly spending millions of dollars on things that are directly related to poverty. The amount of crime that we have, year before last in Milwaukee, the city budget, 53% of the city budget went to the Milwaukee Police Department. Let me repeat that. 53% of the city of Milwaukee's budget, a year and a half ago, went to the Milwaukee Police Department. We're spending all that money because we have high rates of crime, because we have high rates of poverty, we have high rates of unemployment. All of those things lead to you creating something to deal with those things. And unless we deal with poverty, and I say this and I'll say it again, the minimum wage is, we should be ashamed of ourselves to even say that we have a minimum wage. Because let me tell you about the minimum wage. Not only is it only $7.25 an hour, you work 40 hours a week, 2,080 hours in a year if you work full time, you're going to make $15,000 before taxes in a year. That's nothing. But guess what? The minimum wage is the same in almost every, the federal minimum wage is the same in every community. The average house in San Francisco is $1.2 million. It's way more expensive to live in San Francisco than it is to live in Racine. Way more expensive it is to live in my little town with 1,500 people in Mississippi, my hometown. But the minimum wage is the same in both places. The minimum wage needs to be increased. And all of these business owners that whine and complain, oh, it's going to cut into my profits, deal with it. You went into business, business is competitive. If you want to compete, you better figure it out. Because if you don't, what's happening is the products you're making, the people that are working for you can't even buy. That's what we are as a nation. We make all kinds of stuff, but we can't even afford to buy it. Unless we use a credit card. We know what happens when you use credit cards. All right. Last couple things. Do what you can to improve the condition of the poor parts of our community. Go into those poor communities with a sense of humbleness. Don't go in there as a savior. They don't want a savior. They want you to come in and say, what can I do to help? They don't want you to come in and say, hey, you need to fix that. You need to stop doing this. You need to stop doing that. You need to do this instead of that. If you say that, you're going to get cursed out. I guarantee you. You go in with humbleness and you ask people, what can I do to help? And you also do this. You listen to their concerns. And you offer them the ability to find access to those resources that they're looking for. That's what these poor communities are looking for. Recognize that segregation impacts all of us in a negative way, like I said earlier, because we're so segregated, because such a large number of people don't know people from other groups. We live in these little bubbles our entire lives. We don't get to know people. So what we do is we base our understanding of and our relationships with people based on stereotypes. So this is what happened. I'm going to share a story with you. This happened to me several years ago. I've always liked having a pretty nice car, right? So I'm driving one day, and I stop at a red light. And you know what generally happens if a car pulls up next to you and you're at a red light? You glance over at the car next to you, right? So I pull up to the red light, and I have a nice Acura I'm driving, right? And older white woman pulls up in the car next to me, and she's got an old raggedy beater. You know, hey, that's all she can afford. I ain't mad at her, right? But anyway, she pulled up in that car, and I glanced over, and I mean, literally as soon as my head turned, she locked her car doors. And I'm thinking, you think I'm gonna get out of this car to take that car? But I couldn't be mad at her. You know why I couldn't be mad at her? Because I knew that her reaction was an automatic reaction to the unconscious bias she has, which tells her that black people are dangerous, especially black men. She didn't have to think about it. It was automatic. This is what happens when you don't get to know people from other groups. You develop unconscious biases. You develop habits based on those biases. So you lock your doors and you see black people. When you see some black dudes walking with a hoodie on, you grab your purse. These are things that are automatic because of those unconscious biases you have, which you don't even realize you have, but you act on those habits all the time. You can't do anything about your unconscious biases that you don't know, but what you can do is this. Watch your habits. Pay attention to what you do. If you are in the store and you are one of the workers in the store and a black person walks in and you are following them, you recklessly eyeballing that person around the whole store while that little old white lady is over there shoplifting. Because believe me, studies show that the people that shoplift more than anybody else are little old white ladies who are on fixed income and can't afford things, so they take what they need, and people just let them walk out. My brother used to work in security at Walgreens. He could tell you. I'm not saying that to be critical of little white ladies. If I was a little white lady and I was on fixed income and I couldn't afford something, I'd be stealing too, because that's what people do to survive. But what I'm saying is these unconscious biases lead us to watch one group of people when the other group of people is doing the crime. And then, lastly, be cognizant that many of the negative demographic indicators are directly related to poverty caused by job losses, not a lack of desire to work. Nobody who lives in this community owned these big factories that left, right? They were owned by, you know, probably don't even know who owned them. Some wealthy person that may not have even lived in this community. And when they closed those factories, just like they closed them in Milwaukee, who suffered? The community, members of the community suffered. But who was blamed for the conditions that were left over after those factories left? The people in the community. We blame the people in the community when they are simply the victims of a poor policy on the part of our business and elected officials, because this is what's happened. We were an agrarian economy for years, an economy of farmers. We switched out to an industrial-based economy, and now we don't know what we are. People say, oh, we're technology. No, we aren't. Most jobs will not be related to technology, and most of those jobs will require high levels of education. Most new jobs that are created are service sector jobs. Being a greeter at Walmart, being that security guard at Walgreens, you know, service sector jobs are the jobs being created, and they don't pay the same. So let's understand very clearly, this is the last message I have for you, that segregation is not something that is going to go away. And one of the things that people think will help is, well, maybe black people just start moving to the suburbs that would alleviate segregation. Listen, let me tell you something. Black people don't just want to pack up and move to the suburbs just for the sake of moving to the suburbs. Now, if they want to move to the suburbs and be treated well, then that's another thing. I know plenty of black people that have moved to suburbs in Milwaukee and they've been treated poorly. They've had the police called on them. They've been followed by the police. One of my best friends, her husband, they've been living in the North Shore in the same house for the last 12 years, and literally every other week the police stop her husband on his way walking home from work, from the school that he works at. Every other week he gets stopped. Last year, a police officer from one of the neighboring communities stopped him, forced him to lay on the ground on his face in the rain, pointed a gun at him, and asked him, "Do you want me to shoot you?" Welcome to the North Shore. So blacks are not going to be rushing to these communities that they're not welcome in, where their young kids are going to be called the N-word and all kinds of other stuff and be mistreated. And the other thing, people have told me that, Reggie, well, what can I do as a white person? What can I do? Well, you can do these things, but really what you have to do, you have to begin to change your heart and your mind about how you see the world around you, how you treat people, be cognizant of your habits, and then that ripple effect will play off on other people you know. Because the example you set, when you're at Thanksgiving dinner and Uncle Bob says that same racist joke he says every year, and you finally say, "Uncle Bob, I don't hear a joke anymore," you're saying what a bunch of other people in your family want to hear, but they're too afraid to say that to Uncle Bob. It works for everybody. What helps one helps us all. And the last thing I want to share with you, because this is a message that I've been sharing around the country as I've traveled, particularly here in the state of Wisconsin, we can do better. We should do better. We better do better. Because if we don't, the problems that we have will not go away, people. The problems will not go away by us sitting on our behinds and saying, well, hopefully some elected official will fix everything, because they're not. There's only so much elected officials can do. They only have a certain amount of power to impact our communities. We impact dozens of people every day. We impact our families, our friends, our neighbors.
The Racine Public Library will be closing in 5 minutes. If you have any last minute checkouts, please do so now. The internet terminals will be closing down now. Thank you.
Last thing I want to share with you all. Thank you, Racine. I love you guys so much.